On the night of 23rd October 1942, in the Egyptian desert, a British tank sergeant sat under a canvas roof that was not supposed to exist. From the air, his vehicle looked like a harmless lorry parked in a row of other trucks. Wheels neatly aligned, canvas sides sagging slightly with the night breeze. Up close, Sergeant Tom Willis could smell the truth. Beneath the fabric bodywork was a fighting machine, a diesel reek of a Grant tank, steel plates sweating desert dust, a 75mm gun pointed straight ahead but invisible behind the false truck sides. His crew whispered inside the cramped hull, feeling the tremors of distant engines in the dark. For weeks, they had been told that the big offensive was still days away. Everyone could see the long line of water pipeline creeping across the desert, incomplete, its last sections still lying in neat stacks of pipe beside the trench. Everyone knew you could not attack without water. And everyone had heard the same rumor. The main blow, when it finally came, would fall in the south, far from the coast road. Then, just after sunset, the lie reached Tom's ears in reverse. A dispatch rider roared up out of the gloom, stopped beside the lorry, and handed a message to the squadron leader. Minutes later, the order came down the row. "Sun shields off, engines on. We move tonight." Canvas roofs were unhooked and swung aside. What had looked like a line of trucks became a line of tanks, gun barrels appearing one after another, like predators lifting their heads. The men in the steel hulls stared toward the unseen enemy, realizing that they had been living inside a deception so wide that even they had believed it. Somewhere out there, beyond belts of mines and wire, German and Italian guns were pointing the wrong way, waiting for an attack that would not come. At least not where they expected. Behind this moment stood one man, Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery of the British 8th Army. And he had decided to win this battle not only with artillery and armor, but with a carefully constructed lie that fooled his enemies and much of his own army as well. North Africa in mid-1942 was a graveyard of British hopes. In the summer, Rommel's Panzerarmee Afrika had smashed through Gazala, captured Tobruk, and driven east to the Egyptian frontier. Only at the narrow choke point of El Alamein, between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression, had the British finally held. The first battle of El Alamein had ended in stalemate. Both sides were exhausted. Dug in behind belts of mines the troops called Devil's Gardens. Montgomery arrived in August to take over a battered 8th Army that had learned to expect defeat in the open desert. He brought two things: ruthless insistence on preparation and a cool belief in deception as a weapon. He told his officers there would be no more retreats, no more improvised stopping battles. When they went forward again, it would be with overwhelming firepower and a plan that left nothing to chance. That plan had a code name: Operation Lightfoot for the assault itself, and hidden within it, another name: Operation Bertram, the Grand Deception. In Cairo, months earlier, a secret unit known as A-Force had already been experimenting with trickery. Under the direction of Colonel Dudley Clark, they had staged phantom divisions with invented radio traffic, created fake orders of battle, and even sent actors dressed as generals on misleading tours. Clark's job was to poison Axis intelligence with believable lies. For El Alamein, he was told to do something far more ambitious: make Rommel believe the main British attack would fall in the south, and make him believe it would not begin until roughly 2 days after the real date. To turn that idea into something the enemy's pilots and reconnaissance officers could see, Clark needed a stage director in the desert itself. That man was Jeffrey Barkas, a former filmmaker who now ran the Middle East Camouflage Directorate. Barkas understood cameras, perspective, and how easily the human eye could be tricked when looking down from several thousand feet. Under his direction, teams of engineers, artists, carpenters, and ordinary soldiers began to build a false army. They did not try to make the Eighth Army disappear. That was impossible. Instead, they replaced reality with something more useful. In the northern sector, where Montgomery intended to send his real attack, the heavy armor was hidden in plain sight. Tanks were fitted with light metal frames and canvas sun shields that made them resemble trucks when seen from above, right down to a painted cab and tarpaulin-covered load. A Grant or Sherman could be transformed into a lorry in a few minutes by a crew of 2. Hundreds of these disguises were manufactured and issued more than 700 sunshields in all, enough for an entire armored corps. At the same time, dummy tanks were built out of wood, canvas, and scrap. They were simple but convincing: a skeleton of poles, a fabric hull, a gun barrel made from pipe. From the ground, they looked flimsy, but from 2 kilometers up, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. Barkas's teams erected more than 400 fake tanks and around 100 fake guns, along with nearly 2,000 dummy soft-skinned vehicles in an area south of the real intended breakthrough point. Supply dumps were treated the same way. Mountains of fuel cans were stacked in sunken trenches beside the El Alamein railway, where shadows hid them from enemy cameras. Food and ammunition were piled into boxy shapes and covered with nets so that, on a blurred Luftwaffe photograph, they looked like parked trucks rather than the lifeblood of an army. The most audacious touch was the water pipeline. Everyone in the desert knew that an army needed vast quantities of water to attack. A pipeline was visibly constructed, track by track, from the rear areas toward the southern flank where the dummy armored concentration was growing. It advanced at a measured pace of about 5 miles a day. Pump houses, water towers, and even straw workers appeared along its route. Crucially, in the 3rd week of October, the pipeline was still several days short of the front line. To any German analyst, this implied that the British could not launch their main operation until it was complete. Montgomery's deception did not stop at fooling Axis eyes. To strengthen the illusion, many British officers and men were allowed, sometimes encouraged, to believe the cover story. Units were briefed on a supposed southern thrust. Maps circulated in some headquarters with arrows pointing toward the south, where the dummy tanks sat in tidy rows. Engineers genuinely labored on the pipeline, convinced they were building the lifeline for a future attack. Men like Tom Willis saw trucks crowded in the northern assembly areas and tanks parked far back from the front. And they drew the obvious conclusion: the real blow would come later, and elsewhere. Only a relatively small circle of senior commanders and planners knew the full picture. XX Corps in the north, supported by X Corps armor, would deliver the main strike along the coastal sector, where terrain allowed easier movement and supply. Corps in the south would hold and pin the enemy with limited attacks, playing the role of the convincing decoy. If rumors and partial maps misled junior officers, Montgomery did not correct them. Security and deception were 2 sides of the same coin. Across the lines, the Axis position was powerful on paper and fragile in reality. Panzer Armee Afrika, now under General Georg Stumme, while Rommel was on sick leave in Europe, held a narrow front but faced growing shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spares. German and Italian units had dug in behind deep belts of mines, anti-tank guns, and wire. They expected the British to attack eventually, but they believed they would see it coming. Reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs of apparent armor concentrations in the south and static truck parks in the north. The slow pipeline supported the picture of a delayed buildup. The desert itself seemed to confirm what A Force wanted them to believe. When Rommel briefly returned to the front in October, he studied these reports with his staff. To him, the pattern looked familiar. British armored divisions forming for a wide flanking move through the southern desert, where he had beaten them before. He concentrated his best anti-tank units and mobile reserves to meet such a thrust, while assuming that any northern assault would be secondary, slowed by minefields and the proximity of the sea. The idea that the British had turned the northern sector into a stage set did not occur to him. Meanwhile, 8th Army prepared for a very different kind of battle. Montgomery had no intention of repeating the fluid seesaw desert maneuvers of earlier campaigns. Instead, he planned a set-piece offensive, starting with a massive night bombardment to blast corridors through the minefields. The infantry of XXX Corps Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, and British units would lead the way on foot, their weight too light to trigger most anti-tank mines, which gave Operation Lightfoot its name. Engineers would work under fire to clear lanes wide enough for tanks to follow. Once through, the armored divisions would fight a brutal battle of attrition with the panzers on ground of Montgomery's choosing. The deception plan was timed to the hour. For weeks, tanks had been kept far to the rear, in areas where German reconnaissance could see them clearly. Trucks had occupied the northern assembly zones closest to the planned breach, forming what looked like ordinary transport columns. 2 nights before the assault, under moonless skies, this picture flipped. In the Martello area north of the El Alamein Railway, drivers quietly moved their trucks out of the forward parks and back to the rear. Tanks rolled up to take their place, each one instantly disappearing beneath a sun shield. By dawn, from the air, nothing seemed to have changed. The same neat rows of lorries sat where they had been for weeks. That same night, the now vacated tank areas in the rear sprouted dummy vehicles canvas and wood shells propped over shallow pits. To German eyes, the following day, the armored divisions still seemed to be days away from the front. Men like Tom knew something was happening only when their officers told them to stay close to their machines and keep noise to a minimum. They still saw the pipeline creeping across the desert, still unfinished. Some joked that the staff had changed their minds again, that perhaps they would spend winter under these wretched canvas roofs. Then, on 23rd of October, orders came down in plain language. Tonight, the barrage would begin. At 21:40 local time, under a bright full moon, more than 800 British field and medium guns opened fire almost simultaneously across the 8th Army front, from the sea to the desert. The air filled with a continuous roar as shells walked forward across Axis positions. For 20 minutes, the guns pounded the entire line. Then their fire shifted to pre-planned targets, hammering bunkers, gun pits, and suspected headquarters. By the end of the night, each gun would fire hundreds of rounds, over 500,000 shells in total. On the Axis side, dust and smoke rose in towering clouds. Radio nets crackled with half-coherent reports. German and Italian infantry huddled in foxholes as the ground shook. Many officers believed this was only a preliminary bombardment. The pipeline was not complete. The supposed armored mass in the south still seemed poised for a later blow. They did not yet understand that the real dagger was already moving in the north, concealed until the last hours. As the barrage rolled on, the infantry of XXX Corps stepped off. In small columns, spaced out to reduce casualties from shell bursts, they moved into the mine belts. Engineers followed with hand tools and mine detectors, cutting narrow lanes under fire. Men died clearing those paths, bodies marking invisible borders between safety and sudden annihilation. Behind them, in the dust and moonlight, Tom's tank lurched forward, still covered by its deceitful roof. Only when they were close enough to risk friendly bombs mistaking them for trucks did the crews finally drop their disguises. Lightweight frames were unbolted and shoved aside. Canvas coverings collapsed into the sand. The armored corpse emerged from its costume. When dawn touched the desert, what German observers had thought were harmless concentrations of logistics vehicles became a forest of tank turrets and gun barrels. In the south, the dummy army played its part. Fake tanks and guns sat in carefully arranged patterns. Real guns were also hidden there among the fakes, and when Axis armor probed toward what they thought was a weakly held sector, some found themselves under unexpectedly heavy fire from positions they had dismissed as decoys. Barkas later recalled an Axis tank force pushing into an area they believed filled with dummy artillery and being shocked to find themselves under accurate, massed fire. The line between illusion and reality had blurred in deadly fashion. For several days, the battle around El Alamein became a grinding contest of will and metal. British and Commonwealth infantry fought forward through the minefields at terrible cost, seizing bridgeheads in the Axis line. Armored brigades pushed into these gaps, only to be met by German 88mm guns firing over open sights. Tanks burned on both sides, their wrecks scattering the desert with blackened hulks. Yet the underlying geometry of the battle favored Montgomery. His real weight lay in the north, where the terrain was narrower, the supply lines shorter, and the deception had drawn away some Axis reserves. Rommel, back in command, misread British intentions repeatedly in the opening days, keeping forces poised for a southern counterstroke that never came while the critical struggle developed closer to the sea. By the time he realized the northern attack was the main effort, it was too late to fully restore the balance. Inside 8th Army, the psychological effect of the deception was revealed in reverse. As the attack unfolded, more and more soldiers realized just how thoroughly they themselves had been misled. Officers who had confidently briefed their men on a southern turning movement now found their units fighting hard in the north. Men who had watched the pipeline's slow advance and assumed delay now learned that the water they needed had been stockpiled in hidden trenches and cunningly concealed dumps. The truck columns they had seen for weeks turned out to have been tanks all along, sitting quietly beneath their thin skins of canvas. Some grumbled that they had been kept in the dark. Others felt a fierce satisfaction in having been part of such an elaborate trick. One thing was clear: the lie had not been reserved for the enemy. As the days wore on, the Axis position deteriorated. The attritional battle Montgomery wanted began to tell. British industry and Allied shipping had poured men, tanks, and guns into Egypt in the months before the battle. Axis convoys had been savaged in the Mediterranean. Fuel shortages crippled German and Italian mobility. When Rommel tried to counterattack, his panzers often lacked the fuel to exploit opportunities. With each failed thrust, the initiative slipped further away. On 2nd November, Montgomery launched a concentrated assault on a sector nicknamed the Rahman Track, where repeated blows had already weakened the Axis line. The attack, supported by massive artillery fire and wave after wave of tanks, finally broke through. German and Italian units began to pull back, some in reasonable order, others in fragments. Within days, the disciplined withdrawal turned into retreat. The minefields and fortifications of El Alamein, which had seemed impregnable months earlier, were left behind in the dust. Among the many German officers captured in the aftermath was General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, commander of the Afrika Korps. Photographs from the time show him standing in worn desert uniform, saluting Montgomery after his surrender. Behind their formal gestures lay a hidden conversation about what had really happened. Allied interrogators later reported that senior Axis prisoners had been genuinely taken in by the false tank concentrations and the deceptive pipeline. They had expected the main British assault days later than it came, and in a direction where almost nothing of consequence ever moved. In London, Winston Churchill announced the victory to Parliament, calling it not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. In his speech, he singled out the desert camouflage efforts, praising the way a whole armored corps had slipped from one place to another under cover of a marvelous system of camouflage that left their enemy peering at an exact simulacrum of tanks where none remained. After the war, historians combed through archives, aerial photographs, and interrogation reports to measure the impact of Operation Bertram. The numbers of dummy tanks, guns, and vehicles built from wood and fabric were impressive. The sunshield devices, dreamed up from a sketch by an earlier Middle East commander and refined by Barkas's teams, became case studies in military deception. German post-war analyses admitted that British preparations had been misread. They had believed the main attack was still days away and wrongly focused on the south. But the most striking lesson lay not in tonnages or counts of decoys, but in how completely a narrative had been planted in the minds of thousands of men on both sides. Montgomery's genius at El Alamein did not lie solely in his artillery programs, his careful staging of divisions, or his refusal to retreat. It lay in his willingness to let even his own army live inside a constructed story until the moment it had to be shattered. Junior officers briefed cover plans as if they were real. Sappers sweated over pipelines whose very incompleteness was part of the trick. Tank crews slept beneath canvas roofs that turned them into props. At the crucial hour, the general pulled away the scenery, and the true shape of his forces emerged. The Second Battle of El Alamein is remembered as a turning point, a moment when the Axis tide in North Africa finally receded for good. Strategically, it secured the Suez Canal, protected Middle Eastern oil, and paved the way for Allied landings further west. Psychologically, it broke the myth of Rommel's invincibility and restored Allied confidence. But beneath all of that lies a quieter truth. Steel and courage were guided by a lie carefully built over weeks, laid out across the sand with canvas, pipes, and fake shadows. In the end, the men who had been deceived most intimately were often those wearing British khaki. They marched, sweated, and bled inside a plan they did not fully know, believing rumors about Southern thrusts and delayed timetables. Only later did many of them realize that their general had used them as pieces in a vast illusion, trusting that the shock of discovering the truth would be outweighed by the advantage gained. The desert around El Alamein never forgot. Rusted tank hulls, some real, some once fake, lay scattered for decades. Old pipeline trenches traced ghost lines across the sand. In museums, photographs still showed tanks dressed as lorries, canvas shells half open like discarded costumes. They are relics of a night when an army changed shape under cover of darkness and marched into history. Led by a commander who understood that, in war, the right lie at the right time can be as deadly as any gun. Bernard Montgomery did not just win a battle with artillery and armor. At El Alamein, he won a battle by lying carefully, systematically, and sometimes even to his own troops, and by turning the North African desert into the greatest stage his deception experts would ever build.